in darkness.
The uninterrupted humming of idle engines covers the streets, only to be complemented by the violating smell of exhaust. The convoy of yellow cars stretches endlessly around the city. A single vehicle manages to pull to the side of the street, moving away from the mass. The door swings open, and out jumps a Labrador into the bustling metropolis. Holding its harness, a large man lifts himself out of the car and onto the pavement. Pulling out a wallet, he feels through the individual notes, grabs one, and hands it to the driver.
Keep the change.
The taxi peels away and enters the uniform collection of cars. Gripping its harness, the dog weaves around foot traffic, leading Nate across the sidewalk to a diner entrance. Arm outstretched, they make their way through the doorway and to the front of the restaurant. The room was filled with the woody aroma of coffee and murmur of quiet conversation.
Over here, Nate.
A voice shouts from the back wall. Nate confidently makes his way to the source of the voice, reaching a table with the young man sitting down. The young man stands up and awkwardly embraces Nate with a certain familiarity. They sit down opposite one another, parted only by a small vase of petunias. "You been waiting long, Josh?" Nate asks. "I don't know, 20 minutes maybe," Josh suggests. "Were you okay getting here?" "Yeah, this old girl has my back," Nate says, stroking the Labrador's fur from under the table. The two men sit. An awkward lull holds the conversation. Josh's eyes wander over the mosaic flower vase, his fingers running along the uneven surface. "Anyone have your back?" Nate asks. "Yeah, I'm fine. Besides, you're the one who isn't okay," Josh says defensively. "It's just, we haven't spoken since Dad's funeral, and I know you're under a lot of stress," Nate says. "Don't pity me," he desperately whispers. "I had to be strong for all of us. Since you came back from deployment injured, we had..." Nate recalls sitting in that bed, the caustic smell of disinfectant and dissonant noise of medical machinery. Darkness. The fear of the dark was a primal one. The nurse assured him of his safety, yet a gripping tension covered his chest, suffocating his interior. Drifting in and out of consciousness, there was no change, only the relentless void that was now his existence. Nate sat there silently, allowing the onslaught of verbal frustration to surge over him. Josh's brow is creased and neck arched over the table, his knuckles white from clutching either side of the vase. The diner sat in a still silence, prudent of the discourse unfolding. Josh slumps down in his seat, blank-faced and a 1,000-yard stare. Nate saw through it. It was the same face he'd worn for months after his injury. "I know that this is a call for help. I can see that much."
Within your imaginative, you propose the idea of vulnerability shaping identity, and that vulnerability, being exposure to some kind of harm, physical or psychological, could dictate all our actions, that we are constantly, subconsciously, deciding what will limit harm to us. This brings us to your story. Having the brothers contrast one another is key to my story. Nate, a disabled man, is inherently vulnerable, accepted his weakness, and has grown his identity from it. Then with Josh, who has allowed vulnerability to dictate his actions or identity from fear of being damaged. Not acknowledging this vulnerability out of fear of shame, Josh's character shows that vulnerability shapes all our identities, that vulnerability holds no boundaries. I suppose it's Nate's development from past trauma and Josh's fear of future trauma. Did you have any textual inspirations for your writing? Definitely. Gulliver by Kenneth Slessor uses vulnerability as the cause of so much despair. Vulnerability in the expectation to conform to the tedious nature of life. The technique of sibilance used in I Snap Them, Swollen with Sobbing intensifies the emotion conveyed. Within the last paragraph, the technique of anaphora in You'd Give Me shows pleading, contrasting the defiant tone within the beginning. This was inspiration for Josh's change in tone. You could say the same for Out of Time by Kenneth Slessor, which also shows vulnerability shaping identity in the loss of opportunity as time moves on. For example, the illusion he must open doors or close them is a reference to Alexander Graham Bell's quote that due to regret or vulnerability, we lose future opportunity. Self-Portrait by Frida Kahlo too shows this concept. She painted this shortly after a divorce to Diego Rivera as a representation of her newfound freedom and the acceptance of vulnerability. The visual aspects, such as her cut hair on the floor, with the quote above her, "Now that you're without your hair, I do not love you." This is as to remain with her husband within a typical feminine role would be to remain in denial and vulnerable. She deals with this vulnerability by casting it aside. Some various features of my imaginative are: a shift to third-person perspective within your story allows an objective view of vulnerability between Nate and Josh. The story finishes with the first-person perspective of Nate, allowing empathy with the characters. The use of sensory imagery, in particular auditory and olfactory, within the first paragraph of the story gives the point of view of Nate, showing his vulnerability. Also, the unacknowledgement of vulnerability to appear strong negatively shapes identity and creates weakness, a paradox. Before you go, I'd like to share with you a quote from Brené Brown. According to existentialism, vulnerability is part of the human condition. While being vulnerable indicates the possibility of being hurt, it also suggests one has an increased ability to live an authentic life. I think your imaginative conveys this concept, that the acknowledgement of vulnerability allows one to shape their identity positively.